Before we begin, take a moment to settle wherever you are. Let your weight sink fully into whatever surface is holding you. If you need to adjust your position to find comfort, do that now. There's no hurry. We have the entire night ahead of us. Tonight we're walking into a Russian winter forest. Not the kind of winter you might know from a week of cold weather, but a winter that arrives in October and doesn't leave until April. A winter where temperatures fall so low that breath freezes in the air before it can dissipate, where trees crack open from the pressure of frozen sap, where the silence of snow is so complete that the only sounds for months are the ones made inside 4 wooden walls. We're going to visit a particular kind of house called an izba, a log cabin built from pine felled in the dead of winter, its walls sealed with moss, its floor raised above the frozen ground, its interior organised around a single massive structure of brick and clay that weighs several tons and occupies a quarter of the living space. This structure is called a pechka, and it is not simply a stove, it is the heart of the house. It is the reason the house exists at all. What we're exploring is not just a building technique, it's a complete way of living, a system where daily life synchronises with the rhythm of a single morning fire, where families arrange themselves vertically through a small room according to where warmth gathered, where children slept on platforms near the ceiling and the elderly slept on top of the stove itself, absorbing heat from tons of brick that had captured the energy of burning wood and were releasing it slowly, steadily, for 12 hours or more. This is a story about thermal mass and patient design, about the way you can build a fire once in the morning, a fast, intense burn lasting 2 hours, and have that fire's warmth carry you through the entire day and into the night. About how you can take logs 30 centimeters thick, pack moss between every gap, raise the structure above frozen earth, and create a space so well insulated that a family of 6 or 8 people could sleep comfortably while the world outside reached 40 degrees below zero. We'll move slowly through each element. We'll begin outside in the cold and the forest, understanding first what the izba was built to resist. Then we'll move inward, layer by layer, the selection of timber and the timing of the harvest. The way logs were stacked without a single nail was because iron conducts cold. The moss caulking that sealed every gap and required annual maintenance before winter returned. The entrance vestibule acted as an airlock, breaking the temperature gradient into stages. The doorway with its high threshold and low lintel, engineered to trap cold air outside and warm air inside. And then we'll reach the stove itself, the pechka. We'll follow a morning fire from birch bark and kindling to roaring flame, watch as hot gases snake through internal channels and deposits their heat into brick mass. Witness the critical moment when the damper must be closed. Too early and you die from carbon monoxide. Too late and you waste precious heat. We'll feel the 12 hours of gentle radiation that follow. The way the room stratifies into zones of temperature. The way people position themselves within those zones according to their needs. By the end, you'll understand not just how it worked, but what it felt like to live this way. What it sounded like when the house creaked in the night. Cold. What it smelled like. Wood smoke and bread and sheepskin. What it felt like to lie on top of a warm brick in a dark room while wind that could kill you pressed against walls that held. This is not a dramatic story. Nothing explodes or collapses. No one is rescued. It simply unfolds. The way heat radiates. The way understanding deepens when you pay close attention to how things actually worked. So let your breathing settle into its own rhythm. Let your thoughts slow. We're going to take our time with this. And we're going to begin outside, in the forest, in the cold, where every breath makes a cloud and the silence is absolute. Let's begin the weight of winter. To understand the traditional Russian izba, the log house that sheltered families through generations, you must first understand the cold it was built to resist. This was not the mild frost of temperate climates, the kind that arrives in December and departs by March. Russian winter, particularly in the rural heartlands stretching from the Novgorod forests eastward into the Siberian taiga, was a season that defined existence itself. Winter arrived in October. By November, snow blanketed the ground completely. It would not melt until April, sometimes May. 6 months, sometimes 7, of unbroken cold. This was the rhythm of life for centuries, half the year locked in frost, the other half preparing for its return. The temperatures descended to levels that transformed the physical world. -30 degrees Celsius was common, -40 was not unusual. At these extremes, metal became dangerous to touch with bare skin. The cold would steal the heat from your flesh in seconds, and you would freeze to the metal surface as moisture on your skin turned to ice. Moisture in the breath froze instantly into clouds of ice crystals that hung in the air, visible as a fog with each exhalation. Children were taught never to touch metal with wet hands, never to lick iron, because the consequences were immediate and painful. The air itself took on a strange quality, a sharpness, a ringing tension, as if the atmosphere had been pulled taut. There are accounts from travellers and villagers describing the sound of extreme cold. They said the air rang or sang. It was not a literal sound that you could point to, but rather a quality of the silence, a high-pitched pressure in the ears, a sense that the cold itself was audible. Trees, their sap frozen and expanded within the wood, would crack open suddenly with reports like gunshots echoing through the forest. These weren't small branches snapping under snow weight. These were mature trunks splitting vertically from the pressure of ice formation inside the living wood. The sound carried for great distances in the cold air. A tree might crack in the middle of the night, and the sound would wake sleepers a kilometre away. The forest in winter was a place of contrasts. The evergreens, pine and spruce, retained their needles, dark green against the white. Deciduous trees stood bare, their black branches etched against pale skies. The snow accumulated on every horizontal surface. Branches bent under the weight. Sometimes they broke, falling to the forest floor with soft crashes, muffled by the snow below. Snow fell and accumulated. In open country, drifts could reach the height of a single-story building. Wind would sculpt these drifts into smooth wave-like forms. In forests, snow loaded onto branches until they bowed low or broke. The forest floor became a continuous white surface, hiding the texture of the ground beneath. Fallen logs disappeared under the snow. Rocks vanished. The boundary between earth and air became soft and indistinct. But the most profound effect of snow was acoustic. Snow absorbs sound. A thick blanket of it creates an almost supernatural silence. The world became muffled. Footsteps were softened to whispers. Voices didn't carry as they did in summer. The usual background noise of wind through leaves, of a distant animal movement, of water flowing, all of it disappeared. In summer, the forest was full of sound. Birds called, insects hummed, leaves rustled, water babbled in streams. But in winter, especially in the deepest winter, when the cold was most severe and the snow was thickest, the forest fell into a silence so complete that it felt almost oppressive. There was no bird song. Most birds had migrated or fallen silent. There were no insects. The streams were frozen solid. The wind, when it blew, made no sound through bare branches the way it did through leaves. In this silence, in this cold, the human dwelling became not just a shelter but a complete world unto itself. The sounds inside the cabin, the crack of burning wood, the settling of logs as they adjusted to temperature changes, the breathing of sleepers, the low murmur of conversation, these became the entire soundscape of existence during the darkest months. The days themselves were short. In the depths of winter, in the northern regions, the sun rises at 9 in the morning and sets by 3 in the afternoon. 6 hours of wan, pale light, and then 18 hours of darkness. The light itself was different, filtered through low clouds, reflected off endless white snow. It had a grey, diffuse quality. Shadows were soft, colours were muted. The world appeared in shades of white and grey and the dark green of pine. The cold was not an occasional visitor, it was a constant pressure against every wall, a weight that leaned on the structure day and night for half the year. You could feel it when you stood near a wall, a subtle chill radiating inward, a reminder that just beyond the wood, the world was frozen. Modern buildings fight their environments with active systems. Furnaces that burn continuously, fans that move air, thermostats that measure and respond. The izba was built on a different principle entirely. It did not fight the cold, it simply refused to let the cold inside. This was passive resistance, not active combat. The goal was to create a space so well insulated, so carefully sealed, so intelligently designed, that warmth, once created, would have nowhere to go. The heat would be trapped, held, and slowly released over many hours. The family would not need to tend a fire constantly. They would build one good fire in the morning, and that fire's energy, absorbed into tons of brick, would carry them through the entire day and into the night. But to understand how that worked, we must first understand what the forest provided. The antagonist was the cold. The forest offered the materials for defence, and those materials had to be chosen carefully, harvested at the right time, and prepared correctly. Nothing about the izba was arbitrary. Every decision was born from generations of observation, from trial and error, from the accumulated wisdom of people who could not afford mistakes because mistakes meant freezing. The forest stood around every village. It was the source of fuel, of building material, and of food from hunting. It was also dangerous. Wolves lived there, bears lived there, and it was easy to become lost in the vastness of identical trees. But it was necessary. Without the forest, there could be no survival in this climate. And the forest gave generously if you knew what to take and when to take it. What the forest offered. The izba was not built from just any wood. The choice of material was specific, deliberate, and rooted in generations of observation about which trees gave the best results. This knowledge was not written down in the early centuries. It was passed from father to son, from master builder to apprentice, through demonstration and experience. Pine was preferred. Spruce was also acceptable. Both are conifers, and both share a crucial characteristic. They are resinous. The sap of these trees contains natural resins, sticky compounds that serve as the tree's defense against insects and disease. When the wood is cut and used for construction, these resins remain in the grain. They act as a natural preservative, preventing rot even in the damp conditions created by the temperature difference between a warm interior and a frozen exterior. Birch was sometimes used, particularly for decorative elements or for smaller structures, but it was not the first choice for the main logs of an izba. Birch lacks the resin content of pine. It is more susceptible to rot. It is beautiful, smooth white bark, fine grain, but it is not as durable under the specific stresses of a heated structure in a freezing climate. But not all pine is equal. The quality of the timber depended entirely on when it was harvested. This was perhaps the most critical piece of knowledge in the entire construction process. Trees were felled in winter, specifically in the dead of winter, when temperatures were at their lowest and the ground was frozen solid. This timing was not about convenience, it was about the sap. During the growing season, spring and summer, sap flows through the tree carrying nutrients from roots to leaves. This sap contains water and sugars. The tree is alive, active, growing. If a tree is cut during this period, the wood retains high moisture content. The wood is heavy with water. As the wood dries over the months and years following harvest, it shrinks. As it shrinks, it warps. Gaps open between stacked logs. The seal is broken, the insulation fails. In winter, the tree is dormant. Growth has stopped. Sap flow has ceased. The moisture content in the wood is at its annual minimum. The tree is essentially sleeping, conserving energy, waiting for spring. The wood is denser, drier, and more stable. When logs cut in winter are stacked to build a house, they settle, but they settle predictably and minimally. The structure tightens rather than opening up. This was not superstition. It was an observed reality. A house built from summer-cut timber would develop gaps within a few years. A house built from winter-cut timber would seal itself more tightly as it aged. The difference was measurable, visible, and felt. In a climate where a gap in the wall could mean the difference between comfort and freezing, this knowledge was essential. There was another advantage to winter timber. The cold itself made the work possible. Frozen ground allowed sledges to move easily through the forest. In summer, the forest floor was often soft, sometimes swampy. A heavy log would sink into mud. Horses could not drag the weight, but in winter, the ground was hard as stone. Snow provided a smooth surface. Sledges glided. Horses could drag massive logs over snow without getting mired. Rivers and swamps became highways of ice. A river that was impassable in summer could be crossed easily in winter. Logs could be dragged across frozen surfaces that would swallow a man in warmer months. The entire landscape cooperated with the work of construction in ways it would not during warmer months. The selection of individual trees was also careful. Not every pine was suitable. Builders looked for straight trunks, free of major knots or branches low on the trunk. A straight log was easier to work with and stacked more tightly against its neighbours. A trunk with many branches meant many knots in the wood, hard spots that were difficult to shape and that created weak points where the wood might split. The diameter of the log mattered as well. The logs needed to be thick enough to provide substantial insulation, but not so thick that they were impossibly heavy to move and lift. The standard was typically 25 to 35 centimetres in diameter. This provided enough mass for good thermal insulation while remaining manageable for a team of men to handle. The logs themselves were typically 30 centimetres thick, sometimes more. This thickness was not arbitrary. It represented the point at which the insulating property of wood became genuinely effective against severe cold. Thinner logs would work in milder climates, but here, where temperatures fell to -40, thickness mattered. Wood is a poor conductor of heat, which makes it an excellent insulator. The cellular structure of wood, hollow tubes and air pockets, traps air within the material. Air is one of the best insulators available in nature. It does not conduct heat well. A material full of trapped air, like wood, inherits this property. Heat moves slowly through wood. A 30 centimetre thickness of pine log provides roughly the same insulation as a brick wall, 3 times that thickness, nearly a metre of solid brick. But unlike brick, wood has another property that proved crucial for human comfort. Wood does not feel cold to the touch, even when it is cold. This is because of its low thermal conductivity. When you place your hand on a piece of wood, the wood does not rapidly steal heat from your skin. The surface of the wood warms slightly from your hand's heat, and this warmed layer remains in contact with your skin. You perceive the wood as neutral or even slightly warm. Metal, by contrast, conducts heat away quickly. When you touch cold metal, it pulls heat from your skin rapidly. The surface of the metal that touches you does not warm up. The heat is conducted away into the mass of the metal faster than your hand can supply it. You perceive the metal as painfully cold. Stone does the same, though less dramatically than metal. Stone feels cold because it conducts heat away from your skin. This meant that the interior walls of an izba, bare log surfaces, felt neutral or even slightly warm to the inhabitants. You could lean against a wall without discomfort. Children could play on the floor, which was also wood, without the harsh chill that would come from stone or tile. The material of the structure itself contributed directly to the sensory experience of warmth, independent of the actual temperature. The trees were selected, marked, felled, and dragged from the forest on sledges drawn by horses or oxen. The work was done communally in many villages. A family building a house could call on neighbours for help, knowing that when those neighbours needed to build, the favour would be returned. The felling itself required skill. Trees had to be dropped in directions that would not damage them or entangle them in other trees. A split trunk was useless. Once at the building site, the logs were debarked. The bark had to be removed because bark holds moisture and provides habitat for insects. If bark remained on the logs when they were stacked, rot would begin within the bark layer and spread into the wood. Debarking was done with draw knives or axes, stripping the outer layer away to reveal the smooth, pale wood beneath. The logs were then shaped. They were not left perfectly round. The top and bottom surfaces were often flattened slightly to create better contact between stacked logs. This was called hewing. A hewn log had a flatter top and bottom, but retained its curved sides. This shape stacked more securely than a perfectly round log and created less opportunity for gaps. And then the building could begin, but the building method itself was as important as the material. The timber lock. The walls of an izba were built using a method called the shrub. This is a cage of horizontal logs, stacked one atop the other, interlocked at the corners. The entire structure was held together by gravity and the geometry of the joints. Not a single nail was used in the primary structure. This was not because nails were unavailable, though they were expensive and relatively rare in rural areas. The decision to avoid nails was functional. Iron nails create thermal bridges, and thermal bridges are the enemy of insulation. A nail driven through a log extends from the exterior surface to the interior surface. Iron is an excellent conductor of heat. In fact, iron conducts heat about 50 times better than wood does. In winter, the exterior surface of the wall is at or near the outdoor temperature, perhaps -30 degrees. The nail, being iron, rapidly equalizes to this temperature. the cold travels along the nail's length through the thickness of the wood. On the interior, the head of the nail becomes a point of extreme cold, much colder than the surrounding wood. Moisture in the air inside the warm room condenses on cold surfaces. The nail head becomes a condensation point. The moisture freezes. Frost forms on the nail head. This frost is visible, a white crystal formation on each nail. But it's not just a visual curiosity. The frost indicates heat loss. Each nail is a tiny channel through which warmth is leaking from the interior to the exterior. Multiply that by hundreds of nails, a typical modern wooden structure might use thousands, and the cumulative effect is significant heat loss. The interior surface of the wall becomes dotted with points of frost. The wall's effectiveness as insulation is compromised, so builders avoided nails entirely in the main structure. Instead, they used interlocking joints at the corners where perpendicular logs met. There were several styles of these joints, varying by region and builder preference, but the most common was called the cup or bowl joint. This joint is elegant in its simplicity and effectiveness. A rounded notch was cut into the underside of each log shaped to fit over the rounded top of the log below it. Imagine a semicircular scoop cut into the bottom of a log sized to cradle the curved upper surface of another log. When the logs are stacked, each one sits in the notch of the one above it. The two logs nest together. The weight of all the logs above presses down, locking everything in place. This joint had several advantages. First, it shed water. The exterior of the building would be subjected to rain, melting snow and ice. Water running down the exterior surface would flow over the rounded joint and drip away rather than seep into a flat seam. The curved surfaces did not create pockets where water could pool. This prevented rot at the joints, which were the most vulnerable points in the structure. Second, the joint tightened over time. As the logs settled under their own weight, and a completed izba had substantial weight, dozens of heavy logs stacked high, the notches seated more deeply into one another. As the wood dried over the first few years, it compressed slightly. This compression made the joints tighter, not looser. The structure became more solid with age, not less. Third, the joint was flexible. Wood expands and contracts with changes in temperature and humidity. The interlocking joint allowed for this movement without creating gaps. A rigid joint, like one formed with nails or pegs, would crack or split as the wood moved. The cup joint was simply adjusted. The corners where these joints were visible often protruded beyond the walls. The ends of the logs extended past the intersection point. This created a characteristic appearance, logs sticking out at each corner forming a cross pattern when viewed from above. These extensions served a purpose beyond structure. They protected the joints themselves from direct exposure to rain and sun, further reducing the chance of water infiltration. Building with this method required skill. The notches had to be cut precisely, too shallow, and the logs would not nest properly. Gaps would form. Too deep and the log would be weakened at the notch. It might crack under the weight above. The craftsmen who specialised in this work, carpenters who understood timber, were respected and well compensated. The shape of the building also mattered significantly. Most izbas were roughly square in plan. A square is close to a cube when you add the walls and roof. A cube is the most efficient three-dimensional shape for minimizing surface area relative to volume. This is a principle from geometry. Of all possible shapes enclosing a given volume, a sphere has the least surface area. A cube is the closest practical approximation in architecture. Why does this matter? Heat escapes through surfaces. The more surface area a building has, the more area through which heat can leak. A long, narrow building has more surface area than a compact square building of the same volume, so a square plan minimizes heat loss. The ceiling was low. In many izbas, the ceiling was barely above standing height for an adult, perhaps 2 meters, sometimes less. This was deliberate and crucial. Heat rises, warm air, being less dense than cool air, naturally floats upward. In a room with a high ceiling, the warm air rises and pools at the top, far above the heads of the inhabitants. The space near the floor, where people actually live and work, remains cool. The warmth exists, but it's out of reach. A low ceiling prevents this. The warm air rises, yes, but it has nowhere to go. It cannot pool 10 meters above your head. It pools 1 meter above your head, near enough that you feel its warmth. The temperature gradient is compressed. The warmth is accessible, not wasted in an upper zone no one occupies. This does mean that tall people had to stoop slightly in an izba. It means you could not throw a ball inside without hitting the ceiling. But these were minor inconveniences compared to the advantage of keeping heat within reach. Every design decision reduced heat loss. The cube shape minimised surface area. The low ceiling trapped warmth at human height. The thick logs are insulated. The interlocking joints avoided thermal bridges and tightened with age. But the logs alone, even carefully shaped and stacked, were not enough. Even with careful shaping, gaps remained between them. Moss between the worlds. Logs are round, or nearly so, even when hewn. When you stack round or partially round objects, you create gaps between them, crescent-shaped voids where the curve of one log leaves space above or below the curve of the next. These gaps are small, but they are continuous. They run the entire length of the wall. Air flows through these gaps. Cold air enters from outside. Warm air escapes from inside. The gaps are thin, but they are enough to create drafts. To seal these gaps, builders used moss, specifically sphagnum moss, harvested from the forest floor and from wetlands where it grows in thick, spongy mats. The process of sealing the gaps was called pechka. It required patience and attention to detail. Each gap between each pair of logs, around the entire perimeter of the building at every level of the structure, had to be packed with moss. For a typical izba with 10 to 15 courses of logs, this meant dozens of linear meters of seams to seal. The moss was harvested in the warmer months when it was accessible. It was gathered in armfuls, pulled up in thick clumps from the damp ground where it grew. The moss was then dried. Fresh wet moss would rot if sealed into the wall. Dried moss was stable and durable. The drying process took days or weeks, depending on the weather. The moss was spread out in the sun, turned occasionally to ensure even drying, until it was light and crumbly to the touch. When ready to use, the moss was twisted into rough ropes or simply pressed into the gaps in thick handfuls. A wooden chisel or a flat tool, sometimes called a caulking iron, was used to push the moss deep into the crack, compressing it so it would not fall out. The goal was to fill the entire depth of the gap, from the exterior surface to the interior surface, with compressed moss. This was not quick work. An experienced worker might seal several meters of seam in a day. A complete izba might take a week or more of steady work to seal properly. It was tedious, repetitive labour, but it was essential. An unsealed gap, even a small one, would create a draft. That draft would make the interior uncomfortable and would waste precious heat. Sphagnum moss has specific properties that make it ideal for this purpose beyond mere availability. It is hygroscopic, meaning it manages moisture well. Moss can absorb water when the air is humid, up to 20 times its dry weight, and release it when the air is dry. This property is critical in a building where there is a temperature difference between inside and outside. The interior of the izba is warm and contains moisture from breathing, cooking, and bodies. The exterior is frozen. Where warm, moist air meets a cold surface, condensation occurs. Water appears. This water, if not managed, leads to rot. Wood rots when it stays wet. The moss placed between the logs absorbs this condensation and holds it in a way that prevents the wood from staying saturated. When conditions change, when the outside warms slightly or the inside dries out, the moss releases the moisture as vapour, and it dissipates. The moss also has natural antibacterial and antifungal properties. Sphagnum moss has been used historically as a wound dressing because it inhibits bacterial growth. This same property prevents the moss itself from rotting and prevents the wood around it from rotting. A well-sealed izba with good moss caulking could stand for decades, even a century, without significant decay at the seams. The moss was also flexible and compressible. Wood expands and contracts with changes in temperature and humidity. The logs of the izba would swell slightly in damp conditions and shrink slightly in dry conditions. They would also expand in warmth and contract in cold. This movement, though small, was continuous. A rigid sealant, plaster, mortar, hardened resin would crack under this movement. Gaps would reappear, the seal would fail. Moss simply compressed or expanded as needed. When the logs moved apart, the moss decompressed slightly, maintaining contact with both surfaces. When the logs pressed together, the moss compressed further. It accommodated the movement without failing. But the seal was not permanent. It required maintenance. Birds discovered that moss was excellent nesting material. In spring, when birds were building nests in the forest and in the eaves of buildings, they would pull strands of moss from the walls of the izba. They were attracted to it because it was dry, soft, and already conveniently gathered into accessible clumps. By summer's end, sections of the wall might be partially stripped. You could walk around an izba in late summer and see places where birds had pulled out tufts of moss, leaving small voids in the seam. These voids had to be refilled before winter returned. So every autumn, before the first serious frosts, the household would inspect the walls. This was part of the annual cycle of preparation, as regular as stacking firewood or preserving food for winter. They would walk around the exterior with fresh dried moss and tools, examining each seam. Where moss had been depleted, they would repack it. Where a seam had opened due to settling or wood movement, they would add more moss. Where birds had been particularly industrious, entire sections might need to be redone. This maintenance was not optional. A poorly sealed izba was a cold izba. The work had to be done while the weather was still mild enough to work outside comfortably, but late enough in the season that birds were no longer nesting. October was often the time for this work. After the harvest, before the deep cold, when there was time and the need was approaching. The moss turned the log cage into a true shell. The gaps were sealed. The drafts were stopped. The wood provided the mass and the primary insulation. The moss provided the seal. Together, they created a continuous barrier against the exterior cold. But the shell alone was not enough. The izba had additional layers of protection, not in the walls themselves, but in the spatial organisation of the structure, in the thresholds and transitions between outside and inside. Thresholds and airlocks. You did not enter an izba directly from the snow. There was always a transition space, a buffer zone called the sini. This was not a luxury or an afterthought. It was a fundamental part of the thermal strategy. The sini was an unheated vestibule, a room or enclosed porch attached to the main structure. It had two doors, one leading outside into the weather and one leading into the warm living space. These two doors were never opened at the same time. This was not a rule that had to be enforced. It was simply how you moved through the space. When you entered from outside, you approached the outer door. You opened it. Cold air rushed in with you, and you stepped quickly into the sini. The door closed behind you immediately. The cold air that entered with you was now trapped in the sini. It mixed with the air already there, which was cool but not freezing. You might pause in the sini to brush snow from your coat, to stamp your feet, to adjust to the change in environment. Then, when ready, you opened the inner door and stepped into the warm interior. The door closed behind you. This functioned as an airlock, like the double-door system on a spacecraft or a submarine, a place where you transition between two drastically different environments without allowing them to mix. When the outer door opened, freezing air rushed into the sini, but that freezing air was stopped there. It did not reach the living space. When the inner door opened, the air that entered the warm room was the air from the senior, cool, perhaps 5 or 10 degrees Celsius, but not the negative 30 degrees of the exterior. The temperature gradient was broken into stages. Instead of a single threshold from negative 30 outside to positive 20 inside, a 50-degree difference, there were two thresholds. Negative 30 outside to 0 in the sine, then 0 in the sine to positive 20 inside. Each transition was smaller, more manageable. The shock to the system was reduced, both for the building and for the people. The sine served other practical purposes as well. It was cold enough to function as a refrigerator. Foods that needed to be kept cool but not frozen could be stored here. Smoked fish, preserved meats, root vegetables in sacks, these could be kept in the sine and accessed throughout the winter without exposing the main room to outdoor air each time you needed food. The sine became a pantry, a cold storage room maintained at the perfect temperature by the exterior cold and the interior warmth. Heavy winter clothing was stored in the sine. Sheepskin coats, tulip in Russian, thick and heavy, smelling of lanolin and smoke. Felt boots, valenki, made from compressed wool, excellent insulators against the cold ground. Fur hats with ear flaps. Heavy mittens. All of these were kept in the sini so they would not bring snow and moisture into the warm interior when you entered. Wet or snowy clothing was also left here to dry. If you'd been outside working, chopping wood, hauling water from a distant well or river, your outer clothing might be damp with sweat or snow. You could not hang wet clothing in the warm interior. The moisture would add to the humidity of the living space, which was already high from cooking and breathing. Wet clothing hung in the sini would freeze solid in the cold, and the freezing process would drive the moisture out. Later you could bring the clothing inside and it would be dry, or nearly so. The smell of the scene was distinct. Cold wood, the logs of the walls, unheated, smelled sharper and less resinous than warm wood. Sheepskin and lanolin, the oils in wool, have a particular earthy animal scent. Dried herbs sometimes hung from the rafters of the scene, out of the way. Some households kept herbs here to add a pleasant scent to the coats that hung nearby. It was a transitional smell, halfway between the sharp, clean scent of winter air and the warm, smoky, lived-in smell of the interior. The scene was dim. It had a small window, often smaller than the windows in the living space, or sometimes no window at all. Light came from the open doors when they were open, but most of the time both doors were closed. The scene existed in a permanent twilight. This was not a place to linger. It was a place to pass through quickly, but not hastily. The doorway between the scene and the living space had unusual proportions that seemed strange at first glance, but were deeply functional. The threshold, the bottom beam, of the door frame was very high, often 20 to 30 centimetres above the floor level. The lintel, the top beam of the door frame, was very low, sometimes low enough that an average adult had to duck slightly to pass through. To pass through this doorway, you had to lift your legs high as if stepping over a fence and bow your head as if entering a cave. This was not symbolic, though it acquired symbolic and even spiritual meaning over time. It was functional, based on the physics of air. Cold air is denser than warm air. Density is mass per volume. Cold air has more mass in a given volume than warm air does. This denser air sinks. In a room with a temperature gradient, the coldest air hugs the floor. It pools there like water pooling in a depression. If you have ever been in a poorly insulated building in winter, you have felt this. The floor is freezing even when the air at head height is comfortable. In the scene, which was unheated, the coldest air was at floor level. If the doorway had a standard threshold at floor level, this pooled cold air would flow directly into the warm room along the floor every time the door opened. Cold air would pour in like water, spreading across the floor of the living space, chilling the feet of everyone inside. The high threshold acted as a dam. It trapped the cold air in the scene. The cold air could not flow over the barrier. It stayed on the scene side of the door. When the door opened, the air that entered the living space was the air from waist height or chest height in the scene. Still cool, but not the biting cold from floor level. Warm air, being less dense, rises. It floats upward and pools near the ceiling. In the warm living space, the warmest air was at ceiling level. If the doorway had a standard height, 2 meters or more, the warm air at ceiling level in the living room would escape out over the top of the door whenever it opened. Warm air would pour out into the scene, carrying precious heat with it. The low lintel prevented this. The top of the doorway was lower than the level where the warmest air pooled. The warm air was trapped inside, unable to flow over the barrier. The air that flowed through the doorway when it was open was the mid-level air, not the warmest, not the coldest, but the middle temperature. So the doorway was engineered to preserve temperature stratification. Cold stayed low, warm stayed high, and the opening between them was minimized. The door itself was positioned in the middle of the gradient, where neither the coldest nor the warmest air could escape. The forced crouch required to enter, lifting legs, bowing head, became a physical reminder that you were passing from one world into another. The scene smelled of cold. The interior smelled of smoke and warmth and cooking and human habitation. The doorway was the border between these worlds, and your body had to adjust itself to pass through. Over time, this physical act took on cultural and spiritual significance. The threshold was considered sacred in Russian folk belief. The domovoi, the house spirit, was said to live beneath the threshold or near the stove. You did not step on the threshold itself when entering. You stepped over it. You did not shake hands or kiss across the threshold. This was considered bad luck. Guests were not allowed to linger at the threshold. They should either stay outside or come fully inside. But these beliefs, while sincere and deeply held, were built on top of functional design. The threshold was high and the lintel was low because this design worked. It kept the house warmer. The cultural meaning came later, a way of remembering and reinforcing practical wisdom. But even the floor itself, the foundation of the living space, was protected from the cold below, the foundation of air. The izba was rarely built directly on the ground. Placing the floor directly on the earth would mean constant heat loss downwards into the frozen soil. Instead, The structure was elevated on a foundation called the podklet. The podklet was a structure of logs or stones, sometimes a combination, that raised the living floor 1 to 2 meters above the ground level. This created a space beneath the house, a high crawl space, or in some cases a full-height basement or cellar. This space was enclosed by the foundation walls but was not heated. It was separate from the living space above. The reason for this elevation was straightforward. The ground freezes in winter. In these latitudes, the frost line, the depth to which the ground freezes, can be a meter deep or more. Frozen ground is cold and cold conducts upward. If the floor of the living space rests directly on the earth, cold conducts upward through the floorboards. The temperature of the floor approaches the temperature of the frozen ground beneath it. The feet of the inhabitants are cold constantly. Heat is lost downward into the infinite thermal mass of the earth. By elevating the house, an air gap is created. Air is a poor conductor of heat, especially still air. The gap acts as insulation. The frozen ground is now separated from the living floor by a meter or more of air. Heat loss downward is drastically reduced. The floor remains much closer to the room temperature than it would if it were in contact with the ground. The podklet space was not entirely open to the elements. It was enclosed at least partially by walls, either log walls continuing down from the living structure, or stone walls purpose-built as a foundation. This enclosure prevented wind from blowing through the space beneath the house. Wind would carry heat away rapidly. Still air, trapped in an enclosed space, insulates much better than moving air. In some regions, particularly where winters were most severe, snow would accumulate around the base of the podklet during the winter months. The household might even deliberately pile snow against the foundation walls. This was not to hide the foundation, or for aesthetic reasons. Snow is an excellent insulator. Snow is not solid ice. It is ice crystals with enormous amounts of air trapped between them. A snowbank might be 90% air by volume. This air is what gives snow its insulating property. The traditional shelters of the Inuit, igloos, work on this principle. Blocks of compacted snow can create a shelter where the interior temperature is far above the exterior temperature, even with no heat source beyond body heat. A thick layer of snow banked against the foundation of an izba prevented wind from reaching the foundation walls and added another layer of insulation. The ground immediately around the foundation would still freeze, but the rate of heat loss was slowed. Inside the podklet space, the temperature would be below freezing, but not as far below freezing as the exterior air. Another gradient, another buffer. In some households, particularly poorer ones or in earlier historical periods, the podklet was used to house small livestock during the coldest months. A goat or a few chickens might be kept in the space beneath the house. This served two purposes. The animals were protected from the worst of the cold. The podklet was not warm, but it was less lethal than being fully exposed outside. And the animals produced body heat. A goat produces a surprising amount of heat. An animal is a furnace, burning food to maintain body temperature. That heat radiates outward. In the enclosed space of the podklet, the heat from a goat's body would warm the air slightly. That warmer air would rise, heat always rises, and rise directly into the floorboards of the living space above. The floor would be slightly warmer than it otherwise would be. This was not a primary heating strategy. The heat from a goat or a few chickens is small compared to the heat from the massive stove. But in a system where every bit of warmth mattered, even the small contribution of animal body heat was worthwhile. And the animals benefited as well. They survived winters that might otherwise kill them. The podklet also served a secondary function. It kept the floor dry. In spring, when the snow melted, the ground became saturated, water pooled. In autumn, heavy rains could make the ground damp for weeks. Moisture is the enemy of wood. Wood rots when it stays wet. Fungi grow in damp wood, breaking down the structure, turning solid timber into soft, crumbling pulp. By elevating the floor above ground level, the floor remained dry even when the ground was soaked. Water would drain away or evaporate from the ground, but it would not wick upward into the floor. The elevation was drainage, passive, and simple. The floor would last decades longer than it would if laid directly on the earth. So the izba floated above the frozen earth, separated by air and sometimes by snow and sometimes by the body heat of animals. The house was a vessel, held above the ground, insulated from below as thoroughly as it was insulated from the sides and above. The shell was complete. The thick logs provided mass and insulation. The moss sealed every gap. The Sini created an airlock. The high threshold and low lintel managed temperature stratification. The elevated floor cut off heat loss to the ground. Every element worked together to create a continuous, effective barrier against the cold. But all of this, every carefully chosen log, every handful of moss, every architectural decision, would be meaningless without the heart of the system. The shell could trap warmth, but first the warmth had to be created, and then it had to be stored, because a fire that burned continuously would consume impossible amounts of fuel and require constant tending. The solution was mass, thermal mass, embodied in the single most important structure in the izba, the heart of brick. The pechka was not an appliance. It was not a piece of furniture that could be moved or replaced. It was a structure, a permanent architectural element, a mass of clay and brick that was, in many ways, the reason the entire house existed. The pechka occupied 25 to 30% of the entire floor space of the izba. In a small cabin, perhaps 6 meters by 6 meters, a common size for a modest dwelling, the stove might occupy an area 2 meters by 2.5 meters. That is 5 square meters of floor space in a house with only 36 square meters total. It was by far the largest single feature in the interior. In a larger home, the pechka could be even more substantial. In households with more resources, or in regions where clay was particularly abundant, the stove might be built even larger to increase its heat capacity. The largest pechkas were the size of a small room. You could almost walk inside the firebox, almost but not quite. The height of the pechka was also significant. A typical stove stood about 2 meters tall, reaching nearly to the ceiling. The flat-top surface, the lzanka, was at a height convenient for climbing onto, about chest high for an average adult, approximately the height of a modern kitchen counter. The mass of the pechka was immense. Brick and clay are dense materials. A cubic metre of brick weighs roughly 1,800 kilograms. The pechka, with its thick walls and solid construction, could easily weigh 3 to 5 tons. Some of the largest examples might weigh more. This was not a structure you could move. Once built, it stayed. If the house was dismantled and moved, which did happen, as timber homes could be disassembled and reassembled elsewhere, the stove was often left behind or broken down and rebuilt at the new location. The pechka was usually positioned strategically within the room. It was not pushed against a wall. Instead, it stood with clearance on all sides, perhaps a metre of space around most of its perimeter. This allowed heat to radiate outward in all directions. If the stove were built against a wall, half its radiating surface would be wasted, heating the wall instead of the room. Freestanding, the stove could radiate 360 degrees, warming the entire interior evenly. The location within the room also mattered. The stove was typically near the entrance, but not blocking it. This placement meant that when you entered from the Sini, you encountered the warmth of the stove immediately. The coldest air from the entrance was warmed before it could spread through the rest of the room. The stove acted as a thermal barrier, heating the incoming air and sending it upward and outward into the living space. The exterior surface of the stove was most often whitewashed. The bricks were covered with a layer of clay plaster or lime plaster, then painted white or left with the natural pale colour of the plaster. White served multiple purposes. It reflected light, making the dim interior of the izba slightly brighter. It created a clean, cared-for appearance, and practically, the white surface made it easy to see soot or dirt, prompting cleaning. The surface was smooth to the touch, slightly chalky, like touching a piece of chalk or a dry plaster wall, and it was always warm. Even in the morning before the fire was lit, residual warmth from the previous day remained. After the fire had been burning, the surface was hot, not painful, but too warm to rest your hand on comfortably for more than a few seconds. By evening, the surface had cooled to a pleasant warmth, like sun-warmed stone. You could lean against it. You could sit with your back pressed to it. The warmth seeped through your clothing, into your muscles, easing tension and cold. The exterior was smooth and simple, but the interior of the pechka was complex. This complexity was the key to its function. The firebox, the chamber where the wood burned, was a large cavity accessed through a wide mouth at the front of the stove. This mouth might be a metre wide or more and half a metre tall. It was large enough that you could reach deep inside with your arms to arrange wood or retrieve pots. The firebox itself extended back into the body of the stove, sometimes 2 metres deep. This volume could hold a substantial pile of wood, enough for a single intense burn that would last 2 to 3 hours. But the firebox was not the only internal space. Behind and above the firebox, built into the mass of the stove, were channels, winding passages through which hot gases from the fire would travel. These channels were called immersive, literally smoke turns. They were the labyrinth that extracted heat from the smoke before allowing it to exit. The channels were not straight. A straight path from the firebox to the chimney would allow smoke and heat to escape quickly. That would be efficient for removing smoke, but it would waste heat. Instead, the channels wound through the mass of the stove, horizontally, then upward, then horizontally again in a different direction, then upward again, snaking back and forth. The exact pattern varied depending on the builder and the design, but the principle was the same. Maximize contact between hot gases and brick mass. As the hot gases travelled through these channels, they were surrounded by brick on all sides. The brick absorbed heat from the gases through conduction. The gases cooled. By the time the smoke reached the chimney exit, much of its thermal energy had been transferred to the brick. The smoke that exited was barely warm enough to rise the chimney and carry away, but nothing like the roaring heat of the fire itself. The chimney was a vertical passage at the back or top of the stove, leading upward through the roof. It had to be tall enough to create a draft, the natural upward flow of hot gases, but it did not need to be excessively tall because the gases exiting were not extremely hot. A chimney 2 or 3 metres above the roofline was typical. The construction of the pechka was specialised work. Not every carpenter could build a good stove. Some craftsmen specialised in this work, called pechniki, stove builders. A pechnik understood the principles of draft, of thermal mass, of structural stability. He knew how to design the internal channels so that smoke would flow properly without creating backdrafts or blockages. He knew how to build walls thick enough to store heat, but not so thick that the stove would never warm up. A poorly built stove was a catastrophe. If the channels were poorly designed, smoke might not flow properly. It might backdraft into the room, filling the interior with choking smoke. If the bricks were not properly mortared, gaps would form, and smoke would leak through the walls. If the mass was insufficient, the stove would not store enough heat. The family would need to burn fires constantly, consuming enormous amounts of wood. If the mass was excessive, the stove would take too long to heat up. Precious wood would be burned just trying to warm the bricks, with little heat radiating into the room. A good pechnik was respected and well compensated. When a family was building a new izba, hiring a skilled pechnik was a priority. The stove was more important than almost any other single element of the house. You could tolerate a rough floor or a leaky roof temporarily, but a bad stove made the house nearly uninhabitable in winter. The pechka was the sun of the house. Everything else, sleeping areas, work areas, eating areas, storage, was arranged in relationship to this central source of heat. The social organisation of the family, the daily rhythms, the very feeling of home, all of it orbited the stove. But the stove was not simply turned on and left to run. It required daily attention, daily knowledge, and daily skill. The morning fire. The daily cycle of warmth began in the coldest hour, the darkest hour just before dawn. This was when the previous day's heat had fully dissipated. The stove was still slightly warm to the touch, perhaps, but not radiating significant heat. The room had cooled through the night. The floor was cold. The air near the ceiling retained some warmth. Warm air rises and lingers at the highest point, but not enough. The house needed to be reheated. The responsibility for the fire usually fell to the matriarch of the household, the mother, the grandmother, the eldest woman. This was her domain. The stove was, in many ways, hers. She knew its temperament. She knew how it drew, how quickly it heated, where the hot spots were, when the damper needed to be closed. This knowledge was not written down. It was learned through years of daily practice, passed from mother to daughter, a form of bodied wisdom. She would wake in the darkness. In deep winter, the sun would not rise for hours yet. The house was lit only by a single small flame, an oil lamp or a candle. The lamp was kept burning through the night, never allowed to go out. Because striking a flame in total darkness was difficult and dangerous, the lamp burned in front of the icon in the corner. the sacred images of saints that watched over the household. The flame was tiny, just enough to see by. She rose from her sleeping place. The air was cool on her face. She might wrap a shawl around her shoulders. The floor was cold under her feet. She would step into felt slippers kept nearby for this purpose. She moved quietly. Others were still sleeping, children on the palati, her husband on a bench, an elderly parent on the lezhanka if the residual warmth was still sufficient. The first task was to open the firebox. The firebox had a door or a heavy hinged panel that sealed it when not in use. This seal was not airtight, but it reduced drafts through the firebox when the stove was not burning. She opened this door. Inside was the ash from yesterday's fire, grey, cold, light as powder. The firebox was large and empty, a dark cavity waiting. Some of the ash would be removed and set aside. Ash was useful. It could be used as a cleaning agent, as a component in soap making, as fertilizer for gardens in summer. But not all the ash was removed. A layer of ash on the floor of the firebox was actually helpful. It insulated the bottom, preventing heat from escaping downward, and it protected the brick floor of the firebox from the direct intense heat of the fire, extending the life of the structure. Now, the fire building began. This was done methodically, in stages, each stage building on the previous one. The first stage was birch bark. Birch trees shed their bark in thin, papery layers. This bark is rich in oils, resins that make it highly flammable even when damp. Birch bark was gathered in summer and autumn, stored in a dry place and kept ready for winter. A handful of bark, torn into strips, was placed in the firebox. It was light, fluffy, full of air pockets. It would ignite easily and burn fast. The second stage was kindling. Small sticks, thin as a finger, dry, often pine or spruce with their resinous sap, were stacked on top of the birch bark. The kindling was arranged loosely with air gaps between the pieces. Fire needs oxygen. Tightly packed wood smothers a flame. Loosely stacked wood allows air to flow through, feeding the combustion. The third stage was larger pieces, split logs, perhaps the thickness of a wrist, stacked in a loose pile on top of the kindling. These would catch from the kindling and burn longer, hotter. The fourth stage was the main fuel. Full-size logs, split to fit through the firebox mouth, stacked in a careful arrangement that maximised airflow while providing substantial mass to burn. A typical morning fire might use 10 to 20 pieces of wood, depending on the size of the pieces and the size of the stove. The arrangement of the wood mattered. The logs were not simply thrown in. They were placed deliberately. Some households stacked the wood in a grid pattern, layers perpendicular to each other, creating a lattice with air gaps throughout. Others used a tippy arrangement, logs leaning against each other, forming a cone with a hollow centre. The method varied, but the principle was the same. Air must flow through the pile from bottom to top, feeding the fire. With the wood arranged, the fire was struck. In earlier periods, this meant using flint and steel, striking sparks onto the birch bark until one caught. Later, matches became available, easier, faster, more reliable. The birch bark ignited almost instantly. The flame was small at first, yellow and flickering, but it grew quickly. The oils in the bark fed the flame. Within seconds, the kindling caught. The kindling burned with a sharper, brighter flame. Pine resin crackled and popped as pockets of trapped gas expanded and burst. The sound was distinct, sharp little explosions like distant fireworks. The smell of burning pine filled the room, resinous, sharp, pleasant. The larger pieces caught next. The fire built. The flames grew taller, more vigorous. The firebox began to roar. This roar was the sound of draft. When the fire burns, it consumes oxygen and produces hot gases. Hot gases are less dense than cold gases. They rise. The chimney creates a vertical path for these gases to escape. As they rise and exit it, they create a low-pressure zone behind them. Air is pulled into the firebox from the room to replace the exiting gases. This inflow of air is the draft. The draft creates a rushing sound, a low, hollow whooshing like wind through a tunnel. It is not loud, but it is pervasive. The entire stove seems to breathe, inhaling air from the room and exhaling smoke up the chimney. The fire responds to the draft by burning more intensely. More oxygen means more complete combustion, higher temperatures, faster heat release. The flames inside the firebox leap and dance. They are orange at the base, yellow higher up, sometimes blue at the tips where combustion is most complete. The light from the fire illuminates the interior of the room, adding to the dim light of the lamp. Shadows flicker on the walls, on the ceiling. The house is waking up. The fire burns fast and hot. This is intentional. The goal is not a slow, smouldering fire that lasts all day. The goal is a high-intensity burn that releases a massive amount of heat in a short period. This heat will be captured by the bricks, stored, and released slowly over the next 12 to 24 hours. During the burn, the matriarch might add wood periodically, feeding the fire to maintain intensity. But she does not add wood constantly. She adds it in stages, allowing each addition to catch and burn before adding more. Too much wood at once can smother the fire or reduce the draft, causing incomplete combustion and excessive smoke. The fire burns for perhaps 2 hours, sometimes longer if the stove is large or the day is particularly cold and more heat will be needed. During this time, the room warms noticeably. The radiant heat from the open firebox spreads outward. The bricks of the stove begin to warm. The surface temperature of the stove rises, but the real genius of the system is not the fire itself. It is what happens to the heat before it leaves the house. As the fire burns, the hot gases from the combustion are drawn upward by the draft, but they do not go straight up the chimney. That would waste the heat. Instead, the gases are routed through the internal labyrinth of the stove, the dimubority, the smoke channels. The hot gases enter these channels, forced by the pressure of the draft. The channels are narrow, perhaps 15 to 20 centimetres across, and they wind through the mass of the stove in a complex path. The gases travel horizontally through one channel, then encounter a baffle or a turn, forcing them upward or sideways into another channel. They twist and turn, always moving generally upward toward the eventual exit, but taking a long, winding path to get there. Every surface of these channels is brick. As the hot gases flow past, they transfer heat to the brick through conduction. The brick warms. The gases cool. By the time the gases have travelled through the entire maze and reached the chimney exit, they have given up most of their thermal energy. The smoke that exits is barely warm enough to rise and dissipate, but far cooler than the initial flames. The absorbed heat spreads through the mass of the stove by conduction. Brick is not a good conductor compared to metal, but within a solid mass, heat does spread. The entire stove, all 3 to 5 tons of it, slowly warms. The outer surfaces, in contact with the room air, radiate that heat outward. The inner mass acts as a reservoir, holding heat that will be released later. This process continues as long as the fire burns. Heat flows from the fire into the gases, from the gases into the brick, from the brick into the room. The room warms. The people inside wake to the growing warmth, to the sound of the fire, to the smell of burning wood. And then comes the most critical moment of the entire day. The art of the damper. The fire has burned down. The large logs have been consumed, reduced to smaller pieces and then to coals, glowing red embers that pulse with heat but no longer produce flame. The firebox is full of these coals, radiating intense heat. The bricks of the stove are hot enough that touching the surface is uncomfortable. The room is warm. Now the question, when to close the damper. The damper, the vyushka, is a metal plate or door located in the chimney passage. When open, it allows air to flow freely up the chimney. The fire draws well, smoke exits, heat escapes. When closed, it seals the chimney. No air flows in or out. Heat is trapped inside the stove, unable to escape upward. Closing the damper is essential. If left open, the stored heat in the bricks would be pulled up the chimney by continuing draft. Even with no fire burning, warm air from the room would flow up through the stove and out the chimney, carrying away warmth. The house would cool rapidly. All the effort of the morning fire would be wasted within hours. But closing the damper too early is deadly. When wood burns, it produces carbon dioxide and water vapour if combustion is complete. Complete combustion requires sufficient oxygen and high temperatures, but as a fire burns down, conditions change. The flames diminish. Temperatures drop slightly. Oxygen becomes less available. Combustion becomes incomplete. Incomplete combustion produces carbon monoxide, a gas that is colourless, odourless, tasteless, and lethal. Carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin in the blood more strongly than oxygen does. When you breathe carbon monoxide, it displaces oxygen in your blood. Your cells suffocate even though you're breathing. At low concentrations, it causes headache and nausea. At higher concentrations, unconsciousness and death. If the damper is closed while coals are still producing significant carbon monoxide, the gas has nowhere to go. It seeps into the room, the family breathes it. They become drowsy. Carbon monoxide poisoning initially feels like fatigue. They fall asleep. They do not wake up. This was called ugar in Russian, the poisoning from smoke or incomplete combustion. It was a known and feared danger. Every winter, in every region where stoves like this were used, there were deaths from ugar. Families found dead in their homes, the stove damper closed, the coals extinguished, carbon monoxide having filled the room overnight. It was not rare. It was common enough that everyone knew someone who had died this way, or knew of a family who had. So the timing of closing the damper was critical. Close it too late, and you waste heat. Close it too early and you die. The knowledge of when to close the damper was learned through experience and passed down through generations. It was not guesswork. There were clear signs. The primary sign was the colour of the coals. Flames indicate active combustion of gases released from the wood. As long as there are flames, there is incomplete combustion occurring and carbon monoxide is being produced. Flames in a wood fire are typically yellow or orange, but they can also be blue, especially at the base where the hottest, most complete combustion occurs. Blue flames specifically indicate the combustion of carbon monoxide itself. If you see blue flames flickering over the coals, carbon monoxide is present and burning. This is not safe. The damper must not be closed. As the fire burns down completely, the flames disappear. The wood has been consumed. All that remains are coals, solid embers of carbon glowing red or orange with residual heat. These coals are no longer producing significant amounts of gas. They are not flaming. They are simply radiating the heat stored in their structure, slowly oxidizing in the air. When the coals are glowing red with no visible flame, no yellow, no blue, just a steady red or orange pulse, combustion is complete or nearly complete. Carbon monoxide production has ceased or dropped to negligible levels. This is the moment to close the damper. The matriarch, or whoever was responsible for the fire, would watch the coals carefully. She would wait. Patience was essential. Rushing this moment could kill. She would observe the transition from flame to pure glow. She would watch for any flicker of blue. Only when she was certain from experience, from the look of the coals, from the feel of the moment, would she close the damper. The damper was a metal plate, often with a handle, that slid or swung into place to block the chimney passage. Closing it was a simple physical act. Pull a lever, slide a plate. But the decision of when to do it was complex and critical. Once closed, the system was sealed. The fire was over. The smoke and gases had exited. The heat was trapped in the bricks. The stove became a battery, a thermal reservoir, ready to release its stored energy over the next many hours, and the release began immediately. 12 hours of radiation. The fire was out. The firebox contained only glowing coals, which themselves would cool over the next hour. The damper was closed. The chimney was sealed. No air flowed in or out. The stove was silent, but the bricks were hot. The entire mass of the stove, 3 to 5 tons of clay and brick, had absorbed the energy of the morning fire. Every channel, every wall, every surface inside the stove was hot. The surface temperature of the exterior was high, perhaps 60 or 70 degrees Celsius, sometimes more depending on the intensity of the burn and the mass of the stove. Too hot to touch comfortably, though not quite hot enough to burn skin instantly. This heat did not stay in the bricks. Heat always flows from hot to cold. The hot bricks began to release their heat into the cooler air of the room. This release happened through radiation. Thermal radiation is the emission of infrared light from any object with heat. All objects emit infrared radiation, proportional to their temperature. Hot objects emit more. The sun emits enormous amounts of radiation. Infrared, visible light, ultraviolet. A brick at 70 degrees Celsius emits far less, but it emits continuously. You cannot see infrared radiation with your eyes, but you can feel it on your skin. When you stand in sunlight, you feel warmth, even if the air is cool. That warmth is infrared radiation from the sun striking your skin. Similarly, when you stand near the pechka, you feel warmth radiating from its surface. The air between you and the stove may not be particularly warm, but the radiation passes through air and is absorbed by your skin and clothing. This radiant heat is gentle. It is not the scorching convective heat of a forced air furnace or the dry, intense heat of a modern electric heater. It is a soft, enveloping warmth, similar to the warmth of sunlight on a cool day. It warms surfaces first, your skin, your clothes, the walls of the room, and those surfaces then warm the air around them. The pechka radiated in all directions, because it stood free in the room with space around it. Its heat spread outward 360 degrees. The walls of the room absorbed some of this radiation and became slightly warm themselves. These warm walls then radiated back into the room, contributing to the overall warmth. The floor, the ceiling, the furniture, everything warmed gradually from the radiation. The rate of heat release was slow. Thermal mass, the property of a material to store heat, depends on mass and specific heat capacity. Brick and clay have relatively high specific heat capacities, meaning they can store a lot of thermal energy per unit mass. The large mass of the stove meant enormous total storage capacity, and because the mass was so large, the cooling was slow. A small lightweight object cools quickly. It has little mass to hold heat. A large heavy object cools slowly. The pechka, with its tons of brick, cooled very slowly. Over the course of 12 hours, sometimes longer, the surface temperature would drop from too hot to touch to warm to merely lukewarm. But throughout this entire period, it was releasing heat into the room. The room stayed warm. In the hours immediately after the fire, the room might reach 20 to 25 degrees Celsius. Quite comfortable. As the day progressed and the stove cooled, the room temperature would decline gradually. By evening it might be 18 to 20 degrees. By the coldest hour before dawn it might drop to 15 degrees or slightly lower. This was still far warmer than the exterior, which might be negative 30 degrees, and it was warm enough for sleep, especially when combined with blankets and the use of elevated sleeping platforms. The heat was not distributed evenly through the room. There was a gradient, both horizontally and vertically. Horizontally, the space closest to the stove was warmest. The radiation was most intense near the source. As you moved away from the stove, the temperature dropped. The corners of the room farthest from the stove were the coolest, but even the coolest corner was far warmer than the exterior. Vertically, warm air rose. The warmest air was near the ceiling, the coolest air was near the floor. This stratification was pronounced. The difference between floor level and ceiling level could be 10 degrees Celsius or more. The floor might be 12 or 15 degrees, while the ceiling area was 25 degrees. This gradient was not a flaw in the system. It was expected and used. The family arranged themselves within the gradient according to their needs. The stove's radiation continued silently. There was no fan, no ticking metal expanding and contracting, no hum of machinery. The warmth simply existed, stable and present. You could sit near the stove and feel quite warm. You could move across the room and still feel comfortable. The temperature gradient was smooth, not sharp. By evening, the stove was still warm. You could rest your hand on it comfortably. The surface was like a warm bath, pleasant, soothing. People would lean against the stove, sit with their backs pressed to it, hold their hands against it. The warmth eased cold muscles, sore joints, the general chill of winter. By midnight, the warmth had faded further but was still perceptible. The surface was lukewarm. The radiation was weaker, but not gone. The room remained tolerable, even comfortable under blankets or in the elevated sleeping areas where the warmest air lingered. By the coldest hour before dawn, the warmth was mostly gone. The stove was cool to the touch, perhaps slightly warmer than room temperature, but not radiating significantly. The room had cooled. The cycle was ready to begin again. The matriarch would wake, and the fire would be lit, and the bricks would absorb heat once more. This was the pulse of the household. 1 burn per day, sometimes 2 in the coldest weather. The heat rose rapidly during the burn, then declined slowly over many hours. Life in the izba synchronized with this pulse. But the heat was not evenly accessible. The room had geography, and that geography shaped how people used the space. The geography of temperature. The izba did not have a single uniform temperature. It had zones, invisible but distinctly felt, defined by the physics of heat. At floor level, the air was cool, not freezing but cool, perhaps 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, depending on how recently the fire had been lit and how cold the exterior was. Cold air sinks because it is denser than warm air. Even with the stove radiating warmth into the room, the coldest air in the room settled to the floor. It pooled there like water pooling in a depression. If you stood on the floor barefoot, your feet would be cold. The wood of the floor itself was cool, conducting heat away from your soles. The air around your ankles was cool, chilling the skin. This was uncomfortable, even painful. All after a few minutes. So no one went barefoot in winter. Thick felt boots, valenki, were standard indoor footwear in winter. Valenki were made from wool that had been pounded and compressed until it formed a dense, felted material. This material was an excellent insulator. It trapped air in its fibres, and that air prevented heat from escaping your feet. Valenki had thick soles, often several centimetres of felt, providing insulation from the cool floor. Wearing valenki, you could walk on the cold floor without discomfort. At mid-height, around the level of a seated person's head, roughly 1 metre to 1.5 metres above the floor, the temperature was comfortable, perhaps 18 to 20 degrees Celsius. This was the working zone. People could sit at a table, work with their hands, eat meals, all in reasonable comfort. This was the zone where most waking activity occurred. Near the ceiling, the air was warmest. Heat rises, and the warm air produced by the stove's radiation floated upward and collected at the highest point of the room. Temperatures near the ceiling could reach 25 degrees Celsius or higher, especially in the hours shortly after the fire, when the stove was radiating most intensely. This stratification created 3 distinct thermal zones in a single small room. The floor was cool, the middle was comfortable, the ceiling was warm, and people used these zones differently. The family did not try to heat the entire volume of the room to a uniform temperature. That would be impossible with a passive radiant heat source, and it would waste energy. Instead, they positioned themselves within the gradient according to their needs and vulnerabilities. The young and healthy could tolerate the cooler floor and the mid-level temperature. They worked, ate, and moved through the space during the day without needing the warmest zones. The elderly needed more warmth. As people age, their ability to regulate body temperature declines. They feel cold more easily. Their joints ache in the cold. Their circulation is weaker. For elderly members of the household, the cool floor was not just uncomfortable, it was painful, even dangerous. The very young also needed more warmth. Infants and small children have less body mass to generate heat, and their thermoregulation is not yet fully developed. They chill quickly. The sick needed warmth. Illness lowers the body's ability to maintain temperature. Fever paradoxically makes you feel cold because your body is trying to raise its temperature further. A person with a chest cold or fever needs warmth to recover. So the architecture of the stove included platforms, sleeping areas built into or around the stove, that positioned people at different heights within the thermal gradient. The warmest zones were reserved for those who needed warmth most, the lzba and the palati. The lzba was the flat-top surface of the stove itself. It was a platform roughly 2 meters by 1 meter, sometimes larger, depending on the stove's design. It was at chest height for an average adult, easy to climb onto with a step or a boost. The surface was flat, solid and warm. This was the warmest place in the house. The bricks beneath this platform were the hottest part of the thermal mass. The heat radiated upward through the platform. Additionally, because the lzba was at ceiling height or near it, the warmest air in the room collected around it. Someone lying on the lzba was surrounded by warmth, warm bricks below, warm air above and around. The lzba was not for everyone. It was reserved. In a household, the right to sleep on the lzba was determined by need, not by preference. The elderly slept on the lzba. Old people, grandparents, an aged aunt, a parent no longer able to work were given this prime spot. Their joints, stiff and aching from a lifetime of labour, and the chronic cold of winter benefited from the heat. Arthritis pain lessens with warmth. Stiff muscles relax. Sleep comes more easily in comfort. The surface of the lzba was hard. It was brick after all, so it was covered with padding. Sheepskins were common. A sheepskin with the wool still attached provided cushioning and additional insulation. The wool side faced up, soft against the body. The skin side faced down in contact with the warm brick. Felt mats made from compressed wool were also used, sometimes both, a felt mat and then a sheepskin on top. The heat from below was penetrating. It soaked into the body, into the muscles and bones. It was a deep, sustained warmth, not a surface warmth. You could lie on the lzba and feel the heat seeping into your back, your hips, the back of your legs. It was intensely soothing. The sick were also placed on the lzba. In traditional Russian folk medicine, lying on the stove was a prescribed treatment. If you had a fever, you were placed on the stove to sweat it out. If you had a chest cold, you were placed on the stove to breathe warm, dry air. If you were simply weak and needed rest, the stove was where you recovered. There was some practical wisdom in this. Warmth does aid recovery. It improves circulation, helps the body fight infection, eases congestion. Dry heat can help dry out excess mucus in the lungs. Whether it was medically optimal by modern standards is debatable, but it was effective enough that the practice persisted for centuries. The lzba was a healing platform, a place of rest and recovery. It was not for the young and healthy. They slept elsewhere, leaving the prime spot for those who needed it most. The palati were different. These were wide wooden shelves or platforms built high in the room, either attached to the wall near the stove or suspended from the ceiling beams. They were sleeping areas for children. The palati were typically 1.5 to 2 meters above the floor, positioned where the warm air collected. They were wide enough for several children to sleep side by side, 1 meter deep, 2 or 3 meters long, depending on the size of the room and the number of children. The platform was solid, built from thick planks, capable of supporting significant weight. Children slept on the palati because children tolerate warmth well, and because the palati kept them out of the way. During the day, the floor space was needed for work, spinning, weaving, cooking, tool repair. Children underfoot were a nuisance and a danger, but at night the children climbed up to the palati, and the floor space was theirs. The palati were a nest. The children slept close together, bundled in shared blankets or sheepskins. The warmth from the stove rose and surrounded them. The warmth from their own bodies, clustered together, added to the comfort. It was cosy, crowded, safe. From the palati, children could observe the household. They were above the working space, but still part of the room. They could look down and watch the adults prepare food, have conversations, work by lamplight. They could listen to stories told around the stove, to songs sung, to the low murmur of adult conversation. The palati was a place of childhood, a place where you were warm, fed, and protected, and where the larger world of adult work and worry existed below you, but did not yet fully include you. The palati also meant that children slept in the warmest air. A child's smaller body mass generates less heat, and children can chill more quickly than adults. By sleeping high, near the ceiling where the warm air collected, they stayed comfortable through the night. Adults who did not sleep on the lzba, the parents, younger adults, healthy individuals, slept on benches or low platforms raised slightly off the floor. These were placed as close to the stove as practical without crowding it. The proximity to the stove provided radiant warmth, and the elevation, even slight, kept them out of the coldest air at a floor level. In some households there were built-in benches along the walls. These benches were wide enough to sleep on, and they doubled as seating during the day. At night, they became beds. A sheepskin or felt mat provided padding. Blankets provided additional warmth. The arrangement was not rigid. On the coldest nights, when temperatures outside plunged to -40 or worse, everyone might crowd closer to the stove. The adults might sleep on the floor right next to the stove, tolerating the hardness for the sake of the warmth. On milder nights, or if the fire had been particularly successful and the room was very warm, people might spread out more, taking advantage of the entire space. The family adjusted their positions according to the weather, the state of the stove's heat, and their individual needs. The izba was not a house with assigned bedrooms and fixed sleeping places. It was a single room where everyone slept together, arranged according to the invisible geography of warmth. No one slept directly on the floor if it could be avoided. The floor was always the coldest zone. Even with thick blankets, sleeping on the cold floor would draw heat from your body all night. You would wake stiff, sore, and chilled. Elevation, even slight, made a significant difference. The stove, the lzba, the palati, the benches, these were the furniture of sleep, and they were all positioned according to the same principle: seek the warmth where it gathers, but the room, sealed and warm, also needed to remain breathable. A sealed box with a fire and several people breathing will quickly become stuffy and oxygen depleted. How was this managed? How wood breathes? A completely sealed room is a problem for human habitation. Humans exhale carbon dioxide, we consume oxygen. In a truly airtight space with no ventilation, oxygen levels would drop and carbon dioxide levels would rise. Eventually the air would become unbreathable, first uncomfortable, causing headaches and drowsiness, then dangerous, then lethal. Fires also consume oxygen. A fire burning in an enclosed space will deplete oxygen and produce carbon dioxide and other combustion products. When the stove was burning, it consumed substantial amounts of oxygen from the room. Modern buildings solve this with mechanical ventilation, fans and ducts that force fresh air in and stale air out. Air exchange is continuous and controlled. The izba had no such system. Yet the air remained breathable. The inhabitants did not suffocate. How? The answer lay in two factors: the properties of wood and the ventilation effect of the stove itself during the burning phase. Wood is not airtight. It is porous on a microscopic level. The cellular structure of wood consists of long tubes and voids, the vessels that once carried water and nutrients when the tree was alive. Even after the wood is cut and dried, these vessels remain as tiny channels through the material. They are not visible to the naked eye, and they do not create gaps you can feel as drafts. But they exist, and they allow slow diffusion of gases. Oxygen molecules from the outside air can migrate inward through these microscopic channels. Carbon dioxide molecules from the inside air can migrate outward. The rate of exchange is slow, much slower than if you opened a window, but over the course of hours it is sufficient to prevent the air from becoming dangerously stale. This property is called permeability. Wood is permeable to gases. It breathes, though not in the way an animal breathes. It simply allows gases to diffuse through it at a rate proportional to the concentration difference between inside and outside. This slow gas exchange did not mean the house was drafty. The exchange happened at a molecular level, not as a bulk flow of air. You would not feel a breeze. The interior stayed warm, but the air composition remained livable. Wood also manages moisture through this same mechanism. Wood is hygroscopic, meaning it absorbs and releases water vapour. The interior of the izba was humid from cooking, from breath, from bodies. This moisture would condense on cold surfaces if not managed, leading to dampness and mould. The wood walls absorbed some of this moisture. When the interior air was humid, after cooking a meal for example, the wood absorbed water vapour. The wood's moisture content increased slightly. When the interior air dried out, perhaps after the stove had been burning for a while, heating and drying the air, the wood released moisture back into the air. The wood acted as a buffer, moderating the humidity levels and preventing extremes. This moisture management was critical in a climate where the exterior was frozen solid and the interior was warm. If the interior became too humid, condensation would form on the cold surfaces near the walls, particularly near the ceiling where warm, moist air collected. This condensation would soak into the wood, causing rot. Stone houses often suffered from this problem. Damp, mouldy interiors in winter. Wood houses, breathing and absorbing, stayed drier. The stove itself also contributed to ventilation, but only during the burning phase. When the fire was lit and the damper was open, the chimney created a powerful draft. Air was pulled into the firebox from the room. As the fire consumed this air, more air had to enter the room to replace it. This air entered through the microscopic pores in the wood, through tiny gaps around the door frames, through any small imperfections in the seal. The incoming air was fresh, cold, oxygen-rich. The outgoing air pulled up the chimney with the smoke carried away moisture, carbon dioxide and other stale components. The room was ventilated completely during the burn cycle. All the air in the room was replaced with fresh air over the course of the 2-hour burn. This was active ventilation, driven by the negative pressure created by the chimney draft. It was not continuous, but it was thorough. Once per day or twice on very cold days, the entire room's air was exchanged. Between these active ventilation periods, the wood provided passive gas exchange. The combination of the two, active ventilation during the burn and passive exchange the rest of the time, kept the air livable. The windows also played a role, though a smaller one. In very old izbas, windows were tiny, sometimes no larger than a human face. Glazing was expensive and glass was not widely available in rural areas until relatively late in history. Before affordable glass, windows were covered with materials that let in light but provided better insulation than thin glass. Stretched animal bladder was used, sheep or pig bladder, cleaned and dried, then stretched thin over a frame. It was translucent, allowing diffused light to enter, but it was much less thermally conductive than glass. It also allowed some gas exchange, being organic and slightly porous. Oiled linen was another option, a piece of linen cloth soaked in linseed oil, which dried to a translucent, somewhat waterproof membrane. This also admitted light while insulating better than glass. Mica, a mineral that splits into thin, transparent sheets, was used where available. Mica is an excellent insulator and is naturally transparent. A window covered with mica sheets let in light while losing little heat. Later, when glass became available and affordable, windows were still kept small to minimize heat loss. Glass is a poor insulator compared to wood. Even a small window represents a significant area of heat loss. So windows were small and there were few of them. 1 or 2 small windows might provide enough light for the interior during the short winter days. In deep winter, frost would form on the interior surface of glass windows. The glass, being thin and conductive, was colder than the interior air. Moisture in the room would condense on the cold glass and freeze. Frost patterns, delicate fern-like crystals, would spread across the pane. This frost was not merely decorative, it thickened the window, adding a layer of insulation. Ice is a better insulator than glass. The frost reduced the rate of heat loss through the window. The household did not scrape it away unless they needed to see outside. In the depths of winter, when daylight was brief and dim anyway, the frosted window was often left alone. The loss of view was a small price for the gain in insulation, so the izba breathed slowly, passively through its wood walls and through the occasional active ventilation of the stove burn. The air remained livable, the interior stayed dry enough to prevent rot, and the warmth was retained. The sensory environment inside the izba was distinct and consistent. The sound of stored heat. The izba had its own soundscape, entirely different from the profound silence of the snow-covered exterior. During the morning burn, the fire dominated the acoustic space. The flames roared, a deep rushing sound as air was pulled through the firebox and up the chimney. The draft sounded like wind through a tunnel, constant and enveloping. Pine resin crackled and popped. Pine wood contains pockets of resin. As the wood heats, the resin expands. Pressure builds until the pocket bursts, releasing the resin in a small explosion. The sound is sap, a snap or a pop like breaking a dry twig. In a hot fire, these pops come frequently, creating a rhythmic, almost musical accompaniment to the roar of the flames. The wood shifted and collapsed as it burned. A log, weakened by the flames, would break apart and fall deeper into the firebox. The sound was a crash or a thump, muffled by the surrounding wood but still audible. Sometimes a log would split with a sharp crack, not from burning, but from the sudden release of internal stresses as the wood heated unevenly. Once the fire was out and the damper closed, silence returned. But it was not complete silence. The stove made no sound. The thermal mass radiated heat silently. There was no fan, no ticking metal expanding and contracting, no hum of machinery. The warmth simply existed. Modern heating systems are noisy. Furnaces ignite with a roar. Radiators tick and clank as they heat and cool. Forced air systems whoosh constantly. The pechka was silent. The quiet was profound and restful. But the house itself made sounds. Wood expands and contracts with temperature changes. As the room warmed after the morning fire, the logs in the walls expanded slightly. The wood fibres swelled. The structure shifted minutely. This movement created sounds. Creaks, groans, soft pops. The house adjusted to the temperature cycle, and the adjustment was audible. These were not alarming sounds. They were familiar. Every house had its own pattern of creaks, its own vocabulary of sounds. The inhabitants knew these sounds intimately. A particular creak meant the logs near the door were warming. A certain groan meant the roof beams were adjusting. These sounds were comforting in a way. They were the sounds of shelter doing its job, of structure responding to stress without failing. At night, the house cooled. The logs contracted. Different creaks, different groans. The pattern reversed. The inhabitants, lying on their sleeping platforms, heard these sounds in the darkness and understood them. The house was settling into the cold of night. It was normal. It was safe. Human sounds filled the space. Voices, low and conversational, the scrape of a wooden spoon in a pot, the soft thump of felt boots on the floor, the rhythmic sound of spinning wool, the whir of the spindle, the regular motion, the breathing of sleepers, slow and deep. In the quiet of winter, with no external noise to mask them, these small domestic sounds became the entire acoustic world. Every sound was clear and distinct. You could hear someone moving on the other side of the room. You could hear a whispered conversation. The izba was small and sound did not have far to travel. The silence was also a social phenomenon. In the long winter evenings, with darkness falling by the mid-afternoon, there were hours of time to fill. Conversation was a primary entertainment. Stories were told, folk tales, family histories, stories of the past harvest or the last journey to town. Songs were sung. The human voice, in the absence of recorded music or electronic media, was the source of all music and narrative. The smell of the izba was equally specific. Wood smoke was always present, a faint background scent. Even with the damper closed, a trace of smoke lingered in the air and in the fabric of clothing and bedding. It was not unpleasant. It was the smell of warmth, of fire, of safety. It permeated everything. Your hair smelled of smoke. Your clothes smelled of smoke. Even your skin, after a few days, carried the scent. Bread baked in the cooling oven of the pechka had a distinct aroma. Yeast and flour, the sour, sweet smell of dough fermenting, mixed with a slight smoky note from the residual heat of the bricks. Bread baked in the pechka had a thick, chewy crust and a dense, flavourful interior. The smell of baking bread filled the room, warm and comforting. Slow-cooked meals, porridge, stews, soups, also carried the faint smoke note. Pots were placed in the cooling firebox or rested on the hot surface of the stove. The gentle, sustained heat cooked the food slowly. The smells developed over hours, grains swelling, vegetables softening, flavours melding. Dried herbs hung from the rafters near the stove. Wormwood, mint, St. John's wort, perhaps chamomile or yarrow. These herbs were harvested in summer, dried and stored for winter use. Some were used for tea, some for medicine, some simply to add a pleasant scent to the room. The warmth of the stove released the oils in the herbs, and the scent diffused through the air. It was subtle, not overpowering but present. Herbal, slightly medicinal green. The sheepskin coats hanging in the seeney smelled of lanolin and wool, earthy animal, warm. When brought into the heated room, the coats warmed and released more of this scent. Lanolin has a waxy, oily quality to its smell. It is not unpleasant, but it is distinct. The tactile experience was equally rich. The floor was cool under bare feet or thin socks. The wood itself was smooth, worn by years of footsteps, but it did not feel particularly cold because wood does not conduct heat rapidly. Still, the air at floor level was cool, and after a few minutes your feet would chill. Thick felt valenki insulated against this, keeping your feet comfortable. Walking from the cool floor toward the stove, you felt the temperature rise. It was a gradient you moved through physically. With each step closer, the air warmed. Your skin registered the change. By the time you stood next to the stove, the warmth was palpable, a gentle pressure on your face, your hands, the front of your body. Touching the stove surface was a specific sensation. The whitewashed clay or lime plaster was smooth, slightly chalky, like touching a piece of chalk or a dry plaster wall. And it was warm. The warmth was not uniform. Different areas of the stove were different temperatures depending on their position relative to the internal channels. The top, above the firebox, was warmest. The sides were slightly cooler. The back, farthest from the firebox, was coolest. But all of it was warm. You could rest your hand on the surface for a moment. The warmth seeped into your palm, pleasant and soothing. But if you held your hand there too long, it became uncomfortably warm. Not painful, but too much. You had to pull your hand away. This was the peak of the heat, in the hours shortly after the fire. By evening, the surface had cooled to a gentle warmth. You could rest your hand on it indefinitely. You could lean your back against it. The warmth was soothing, easing tension, relaxing muscles. People would sit with their backs to the stove for long periods, absorbing the heat. Lying on the lezhanka, the warmth pressed into your back. The sheepskin or felt mat softened the hardness of the brick, but the heat permeated through. It was a penetrating warmth, deeper than the surface warmth of the air. It soaked into your muscles, your spine, your hips. It was intensely relaxing. Your body held in this warmth, released tension. Sleep came easily. This was the sensory world of the izba in winter. Smoke and bread and herbs. Warmth radiating from brick, wool and felt and wood under your hands. The creak of settling logs and the quiet breathing of sleepers. And this world was organised by the stove's cycle, the rhythm of tending. Daily life in the izba was synchronised with the stove's cycle. The stove dictated the rhythm of the day because the stove determined when warmth was available, and warmth determined what activities were possible. The coldest hour was just before dawn. The house was at its coolest point. The previous day's fire had fully released its stored heat. The stove was cool to the touch, or nearly so. The room temperature had dropped to its minimum, perhaps 12 or 15 degrees Celsius, depending on the severity of the exterior cold and the quality of the insulation. The inhabitants slept under heavy coverings, thick wool blankets, sheepskins, felt mats. They were clustered on the elevated platforms and benches where the residual warmth lingered longest. The air near the ceiling was still slightly warmer than the floor, and this was where most people slept. The matriarch woke first. This was her task, her responsibility. She had done this every morning for decades. Her body knew when to wake, even in the darkness. She moved quietly, not wanting to wake the others yet. An oil lamp or candle provided minimal light. She stepped down from her sleeping place, perhaps a bench near the stove, perhaps a corner of the lzba if there was space. Her feet found her felt slippers in the darkness. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the cool air. She moved to the stove. The firebox was opened. Inside were the cold ashes from yesterday's fire. Some were removed, set aside. Fresh fuel was arranged. Birch bark, kindling, larger pieces, full-sized logs. The fire was struck and caught. The flames built. The roar of the draught began. The house started to wake. This was the transition from night to day. Marked not by a clock but by the sound of the fire. The roar was the morning signal. Others began to stir, children on the palati, turning and murmuring, an elderly parent on the lzba, waking slowly, the father rising from his bench. The cold of night was ending. Warmth was returning. The fire burned for 2 hours or so. The room warmed noticeably. The surface of the stove grew hot. The family woke fully, dressed in the growing warmth, and began the day's activities. By mid-morning the fire had burned down to coals. The matriarch watched the coals, waiting for the right moment, the blue flames gone, only red glow remaining. The damper was closed. The stove was sealed. The heat was trapped. This was the peak time for heat. The stove surface was at its hottest. The room was at its warmest. This was when cooking was done. Pots were slid into the firebox using a long wooden tool, a ukvat, a paddle with a U-shaped end that cradled the pot. The pot was positioned in the residual heat of the coals or rested on the hot brick surface inside. Bread dough, prepared earlier, was shaped and placed on a flat pan or directly on the brick floor of the firebox. The mouth of the firebox was closed or partially closed to retain heat. The food cooked slowly in the residual heat. Bread took hours to bake, 2, 3, sometimes more, but the result was worth the wait. Porridge cooked gently, the grains absorbing water and swelling without scorching. Stews simmered, and flavours deepening. The room was at its most comfortable. People worked near the stove, taking advantage of the warmth and light. Women spun wool or worked on weaving if a loom was present. Men repaired tools, carved wooden implements, prepared materials for spring planting. Children played quietly or helped with small tasks. By afternoon, the fire was long out. The stove was radiating steadily. The heat was gentler now, the surface warm but not hot. The room was still comfortable, though cooler than mid-morning. Work continued. The stove remained the centre of activity, the anchor around which everything else was arranged. By evening, the family gathered for the meal. The food, cooked hours earlier, was still warm from the stove's heat. The meal was eaten in the comfortable warmth of the room, with the stove still radiating gently. This was social time, family time. Conversations were held, stories were told, the day's events were discussed. After the meal, the evening hours stretched ahead. In winter, with darkness falling by mid-afternoon, there were many hours to fill before sleep. Work continued by the lamplight or candlelight. Spinning, sewing, repairing. Songs were sung, more stories were told. The elderly might recount memories, teach skills, pass on knowledge. Children listened and learned. As night deepened, the room cooled slightly. The stove was still warm, but the peak heat had passed. The family prepared for sleep. Everyone moved to their sleeping places. Children climbing up to the palati, elderly settling onto the lzhanka, adults arranging themselves on benches or low platforms. The floor became uncomfortably cool as the night progressed. The coolest air sank and pooled there. No one slept on the floor if it could be avoided. Everyone elevated themselves, seeking the warmer air that still lingered near the ceiling and around the stove. By the coldest hour before dawn, the warmth had mostly faded. The stove was cool. The room was at its minimum temperature. The cycle was ready to begin again. In a few hours, the matriarch would wake, and the fire would be lit, and the day would start anew. This rhythm, morning fire, midday peak, afternoon and evening decline, cold night, morning fire again was as regular as breathing. It shaped every aspect of daily life. You did not cook whenever you felt like it. You cooked when the stove was hot. You did not work wherever you wanted. You worked near the stove where it was warm and light was best. You did not sleep wherever was most comfortable in an abstract sense. You slept where the warmth allowed you to sleep. The stove was not a convenience. It was the organising principle of existence during the winter months. And at night, in the darkness, with the wind silent outside and the house settling into the cold, there was one place that remained warm longer than anywhere else. The night platform. Let yourself imagine this now in as much detail as you need to feel it. The fire has been out for many hours. The afternoon has passed into evening, and evening has passed into night. It is deep winter. Outside, the temperature is far below freezing, perhaps -30, perhaps -40. The snow is thick and undisturbed. The stars are sharp in the black sky. The trees are silent, their sap frozen solid. Inside, the room is dim. A single lamp burns low, an oil lamp with a small, steady flame, or a thick tallow candle that will last through the night. The lamp sits near the icon in the corner, casting a small pool of light. The shadows are deep and soft. You can barely see the far corners of the room. The stove stands in its place, a pale mass in the dimness. Its white surface reflects the faint lamplight. It is still warm. Not hot. You can rest your hand on it without discomfort now, but warm. The warmth radiates outward slowly, steadily. A pulse of heat that has been travelling outward from the brick core for 12 hours. You are lying on the lzhanka, the flat top of the stove. Beneath you is a sheepskin, the wool soft and slightly oily with lanolin. Beneath that is the brick, and within the brick is the stored energy of the morning fire, still releasing, still warming. The warmth presses into your back, it spreads through your body. It seeps into your spine, your shoulder blades, your hips, the back of your legs. The warmth is gentle but penetrating. It reaches deep into your muscles. Tension you didn't know you were carrying begins to dissolve. Your breathing slows. The cold of the day, the cold that always exists at the edges, even in a warm room, recedes. The floor is far below you. You know it is cold down there. You can imagine the cool air pooling at ground level, settling like invisible water. But you are not on the floor. You are elevated, suspended in the warmest zone of the room. The air around you is still, neither too warm nor too cold. It is exactly the temperature that allows you to rest without thinking about temperature at all. You hear the house creak softly. A log in the wall adjusts to the night cold outside. The wood contracts minutely, and the movement produces a sound, a low groan, almost inaudible, but present. You know this sound. You have heard it every night of your life. It is the sound of shelter, of structure doing its work. It is not alarming. It is familiar, even comforting. You hear breathing. To your left, perhaps an elderly father or grandfather, also on the lzhanka, his breathing slow and deep with sleep. To your right, farther away, the palati where the children sleep. You can hear their breathing too, quicker, lighter, sometimes with a soft murmur or a shift of position. They are warm up there, clustered together under shared blankets, the warmth from the stove rising to surround them. Across the room, on a bench near the wall, your mother or your wife sleeps. You hear the rustle of wool blankets as she adjusts her position. Then stillness again. Everyone is accounted for. Everyone is warm enough. Everyone is safe. Outside, the wind has stopped. In the deepest cold, the air often becomes perfectly still. There is no wind, no movement, just the profound silence of frozen air. The snow acts as an acoustic blanket, absorbing any sound that might exist. The world outside is muffled and distant. You do not hear the wind. You do not hear animals. You do not hear water. All water is frozen solid. You hear nothing from outside. The walls are thick. The moss seal is complete, and the exterior world feels infinitely far away. The only sounds are interior sounds, the creak of wood, the breathing of sleepers, the faint sputtering of the lamp flame. Your own breath, slow and even. The silence is so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat if you pay attention. But you do not pay attention. You let the silence settle over you like the blankets, like the warmth. The darkness is nearly absolute. The lamp provides one small point of light, but it does not reach the corners. The ceiling above you is lost in shadow. The far wall is invisible. You exist in a small sphere of dim awareness. The warmth beneath you, the air around you, the breathing nearby. Your body is heavy. The warmth has made you heavy. Your limbs feel weighted, sunk into the sheepskin, disinclined to move. This is not uncomfortable. It is the heaviness of deep relaxation, of a body that has worked through the day and is now allowed to rest completely. You do not need to tend the fire. The fire is out. The damper is closed. There is nothing to do. The stove will hold its warmth through the night. You will not wake cold. You will wake to the coldest hour, yes, but you will wake on the warm platform, and someone, your mother, your wife, whoever holds that responsibility, will light the fire, and the cycle will continue. For now, there is only this, the warmth beneath you, the darkness around you, the silence outside, and the knowledge that you are held by the architecture, by the wood that was chosen carefully and felled in winter, by the moss that was packed between every log and checked every autumn, by the threshold that he high to trap the cold outside, by the walls that breathe slowly, exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide at a rate that keeps the air livable, by the elevated floor that separates you from the frozen earth, by the tons of brick that absorb the morning fire and have been releasing it steadily, generously for 12 hours. Everything serves the warmth, and the warmth serves you. The stove is not just a thing, it is the heart of the house. It is the reason the house exists. The walls are there to hold the warmth the stove creates. The moss is there to seal the gaps so the warmth cannot escape. The sin eye is there to buffer the cold so it cannot rush in. The ceiling is low to keep the warmth close. The floor is raised to protect from the ground cold. Every element, every decision, every piece of map of knowledge embedded in the construction, it all serves this single purpose: to create a space where warmth can be generated once per day and then held, stored, released slowly so that human beings can survive and even be comfortable in a climate that would otherwise kill them. You sink deeper. The transition from waking to sleeping is gradual and smooth. There is no moment where you decide to sleep. Sleep simply arrives, like the warmth, like the darkness, inevitable and welcome. Your last conscious thought, if it can be called a thought, is not a thought at all but a feeling of being held, not by a person, though people are nearby, but by the structure itself, by the house, by the knowledge and care that went into its making, by the generations of observation that led to this design, this precise thickness of logs, this exact method of sealing, this specific mass of brick. You are held by human ingenuity expressed in wood and clay. You are held by the understanding that survival in this place requires not fighting the cold but creating a refuge from it, a vessel, an ark floating on a white sea. Outside, the temperature is 40 degrees below zero. The trees are cracking from the pressure of ice in their trunks. The snow lies perfect and undisturbed under the stars. The silence is absolute. The cold is relentless. Inside you are warm. The izba has done its work. Closing reflection. This is how people stayed warm in the Russian winter for centuries before electricity, before fossil fuels, before any of the systems we now take for granted. They built shells of wood and moss. They raised their floors above the frozen earth. They created airlocks to buffer the cold, and they built massive stoves of brick that turned a single fire into a day of warmth. It was not effortless. It required knowledge, when to fell the trees, how to stack the logs, when to close the damper. Knowledge that was learned through experience and passed down through generations. A wrong decision could mean a cold house, or worse. Closing the damper too early could mean death from carbon monoxide poisoning. Using summer-cut timber could mean gaps in the walls within a few years. Neglecting the moss seal could mean drafts that made the interior unbearable. It required labour. Felling and hauling timber in the depths of winter. Packing moss between logs, handful by handful, metre by metre. Recorking the walls every autumn before winter returned. Hauling firewood, enormous amounts of firewood, from the forest to the house. Building and maintaining the stove, which required specialised knowledge and skill. It required attention, daily attention to the fire, building it correctly, watching the coals, judging the right moment to close the damper. Attention to the walls, checking for gaps or damage. Attention to the family's arrangement within the temperature gradient, ensuring the elderly and the sick were in the warmest places. But it worked. The izba was not perfect. The floor was always cool, requiring thick felt boots even indoors. The windows were small and let in little light during the already short winter days. The space was confined, an entire family living in one room with no privacy, no separation. The work was constant. Every autumn required preparation. Every morning required the fire. Every winter was a test of the system and the knowledge behind it. But on a night when the wind howled and the cold pressed against every surface, when the world outside was hostile and vast and unforgiving, the izba was a place of warmth and safety. The stove radiated, the walls held, the moss sealed, the threshold stopped the cold at the door, and the family slept, elevated above the cold floor, held in the warmth that the morning fire had stored in brick. This was the architecture of patience, not fighting the cold but outlasting it, not generating heat constantly but capturing it, storing it, releasing it slowly over many hours, not forcing comfort through continuous energy expenditure, but creating the conditions where comfort could exist through intelligent design and thermal mass. The system required no electricity, no complex machinery, no external fuel supply beyond the forest that surrounded every village. It was self-contained, local, renewable in a way that few modern systems are. The forest provided the wood for the walls and the fuel for the fire. The earth provided the clay for the bricks. The wetlands provided the moss for the seal. The animals, if kept in the podklet, provided small amounts of supplemental heat. And the knowledge, the deep knowledge of materials and timing and physics, that knowledge was passed from generation to generation, refined over centuries, embedded in the rhythms of daily life. A daughter learned from her mother when to close the damper by watching, by listening to explanations, by eventually doing it herself under supervision. A son learned from his father how to select timber, how to fell it, how to shape it for building. This knowledge was not written in books, at least not in the early centuries. It was embodied knowledge, practical knowledge, the kind that comes from doing something every day for years until it becomes second nature. The kind of knowledge that cannot be fully transmitted through words alone, but must be demonstrated, practiced, lived. We live differently now. We expect continuous warmth at the touch of a button or the adjustment of a dial. We expect uniform temperatures throughout our spaces, every room the same, every corner as warm as every other corner. We expect not to think about heat, not to tend it, not to plan for it. We expect it to simply be there, always, reliably, requiring no skill or attention from us beyond paying a utility bill. This is, in many ways, easier. It is certainly more convenient. You do not need to know anything about thermodynamics or combustion or thermal mass. You do not need to wake before dawn to light a fire. You do not need to watch coals to judge the right moment for a damper. You do not need to pack moss between logs every autumn. But there is something worth understanding in the old way, something worth remembering even if we do not practice it. The izba taught patience. The stove could not be rushed. The fire had to burn its course. The bricks had to absorb the heat slowly. The warmth had to be released slowly. Trying to rush any part of the process would fail. You learn to work with time, not against it. The izba taught observation. You learn to read the colour of coals. You You learned to hear when the house was settling normally versus when something was wrong. You learned to feel the temperature gradient and position yourself accordingly. You learned to notice when the moss seal was failing and needed repair. The izba taught respect for materials and for the limits of energy. Wood is remarkable, but it has specific properties. You cannot ask it to do what it cannot do. Brick stores heat, but only if it has sufficient mass. Fire produces heat, but that heat will escape unless you trap it. Energy is precious. Every bit of warmth matters. Nothing is wasted. The izba taught connection to the forest, to the seasons, to the labour of building and maintaining. The house was not separate from the landscape. It was made from the landscape. The wood came from specific trees, felled at a specific time. The moss came from specific wetlands. The clay came from the earth nearby. The house was local in a way that modern construction rarely is, and the izba taught a particular relationship between the inhabitants and their shelter. The house was not simply a container that you lived in passively. It was a system that you participated in. You tended the fire. You maintained the seal. You arranged yourself within the temperature gradient. The house kept you warm, but you had to know how to live in it, how to work with it. There is a word for this kind of knowledge: vernacular. Vernacular architecture is building that arises from a place, from a climate, from available materials, from generations of people solving the problem of shelter in that specific context. The izba is vernacular architecture, at its finest, perfectly adapted to its environment, using local materials, embodying accumulated wisdom, requiring no imported technology or fuel. Most of the world's people, for most of human history, lived in vernacular architecture of some kind. Buildings made from local materials using local techniques, adapted to local conditions. And then, relatively recently, this changed. Industrialization brought new materials: steel, concrete, glass, new technologies, electricity, fossil fuel heating, air conditioning, new expectations, comfort without effort, uniform temperatures, independence from local climate. We gained much from this change. We gained comfort and convenience. We gained the ability to live in climates and in ways that would have been impossible before. But we also lost something. We lost the deep knowledge of how buildings work, of how to create comfort through design rather than through energy expenditure. Most people today could not build a shelter that would keep them warm without modern utilities. Most people do not know how their heating system works beyond "I adjust the thermostat." The izba reminds us that there are other ways, that comfort and warmth are possible through design, through mass, through patience, that buildings can work with their environment rather than fighting it, that human knowledge and skill accumulated and refined over generations can solve problems that we now solve with machinery and fossil fuels. The pechka is still built in some places. There are craftsmen, pechniki, who know how to design the internal channels, how to proportion the mass, how to create a stove that will radiate for 24 hours from a single fire. The knowledge has not been entirely lost. In rural areas of Russia, in some parts of Eastern Europe, in places where tradition has not been completely displaced by modernity, these stoves are still built and used. But they are rare now. Most people have moved on to systems that require less attention, less skill, less daily involvement. Systems that burn continuously or cycle on and off automatically. Systems that require no judgment, no watching of coals, no understanding of thermal mass. Perhaps that is progress. Perhaps it is simply change. Perhaps both things can be true. But on a cold night, if you could lie on the warm top of a well-built pechka, feeling the heat stored in tons of brick radiating into your back, surrounded by the smell of wood smoke and the silence of snow, you might understand why, for so many generations, this was not just adequate. It was home. The izba was the place where life happened, where children were born and elderly died, where meals were prepared and eaten, where work was done through the long winter, where stories were told and songs were sung, where sleep came easily because you were warm and safe. The stove was the heart of that home. The wooden walls were its protective shell. The moss was its seal. The threshold was its guard. The raised floor was its foundation. Everything worked together, every element supporting the others, creating a complete system that could take a frozen landscape and carve out within it a space of warmth and human life. And at the centre of it all was a simple principle. heat can be stored. Mass can hold energy. A single intense fire, if its heat is captured in sufficient mass, can warm a home for an entire day. This principle, thermal mass, is as valid today as it was centuries ago. Physics has not changed, but our relationship to it has changed. We have chosen different solutions that prioritize convenience and require less knowledge. There is no judgment in that observation, only recognition. We have made choices as a civilization, and those choices have consequences, both things we have gained and things we have lost. The izba and the pechka represent what we have lost, or set aside. The knowledge of how to create warmth through design, the patience to work with daily cycles rather than demanding instant, continuous comfort, the connection to local materials and to the labour of building and maintaining, the embodied wisdom of generations, but they also represent something that remains available to us should we choose to remember it. The principles still work. Thermal mass still stores heat. Wood still insulates. Moss still seals. The physics has not changed. Perhaps there is value in remembering, even if we do not return to the old ways entirely. Perhaps there is value in understanding that our current systems, so convenient, so automatic, are not the only systems possible. That there are other ways to be warm, other ways to be comfortable, ways that might align better with a future where energy is more precious, where connection to place matters more, where patience and skill are valued again. Or perhaps the izba is simply history, something that was necessary once and is necessary no longer. A curiosity, a relic, a window into how people lived when they had no choice but to be ingenious with limited resources. Either way, the story is worth knowing. The izba existed. The pechka worked. Families stayed warm through Russian winters for centuries using nothing but wood and brick and knowledge and daily attention. And on those long winter nights, when the fire was out and the damper was closed and the wind had stopped and the stars were bright, someone lay on top of that massive stove, feeling the warmth seep into their back, listening to the house creak softly, hearing the breathing of family nearby, and felt not just warm, but safe, held, home.